CNT140. We're continuing our talk through Chapter 1 here. We're working through some of the basics of 568 standard. So they actually have a chart in your book there showing some distances, permissible distance for different cable runs for different applications. Using UTP for copper, 100 meters. Using UTP copper for voice, the older style voice telephone system, you can go 800 meters with it. Your old DSL, you could do up to basically 5 kilometers, a handful of kilometers from the box out to a house, if you will. Multi-mode fiber horizontally, about 100 meters. Multi-mode fiber for centralized fiber up to 300 meters. Multi-mode fiber for backbone between closets, you could go up to 2,000 meters. And if I have single mode, I could do up to 3,000 meters. So I said there, that would be a campus connection. I could go across campus from building to building with a cable that's a few kilometers long. 568 is only part of a structure and cabling standards. There is a number of different areas or a number of different standards that cover different aspects of cabling. So these, keep in mind, we're going to reference these at different times during the semester, and I even have a resource for you to have summaries of these that you can use and look up. 568 is the main standard for structured cabling. We usually just call it the 568 standard. 569 covers your pathways and spaces, and also all the details of kind of the do's and don'ts of your equipment closets, your telecom rooms. 570 is about residential cabling. 606 is about basically documentation, labeling documentation of, and 607 is your grounding and bonding. When we're in the lab room, if you look at the cable trays above your head, you'll see some green cables connecting the trays together. That's part of your grounding and bonding. If there were to be an electrical short that hits that tray, that is grounded so we don't have any issues there, safety-wise as well as signal issue-wise. International standards, international standards basically are the equivalent of what we just talked about. 11801 is basically the same as your 568. Your 14763, this is similar to your 606 about documentation. The 14763-2 is similar to your 569 about closets and spaces. 14763-3, this is testing optical fiber. That's actually included in your 568 standard, a piece of. And then testing copper cabling, again, that's included in your 568 standard, a piece of the 568 standard. We do need to mention, we mentioned this earlier, but just a couple more details. When we talk codes, these are the pieces that are required that we need to do. This is part of like building codes. National Electrical Code is developed by your National Fire Protection Association and actually has aspects of electrical and fire safety in it. Certain things I do and don't with my electrical cabling, installing them, connecting them, that are all about electrical safety and like fire prevention, if you will. They have different sections of the code. 800 talks about your communication circuits, and 770 talks about fiber optics, kind of the do's and don'ts of this. So here are the different pieces. I highlighted those, the 770 for fiber and 800 for telecom circuits, telephone and LAN, if you will. These have things in here that you are to do and not to do. And these would be the kinds of things that are your local building codes. A lot of times they go by county. I don't know about all over the country, but around here they tend to go by county. So these would be your county building codes. And if I'm following these standards and these, I should have everything in place that things should work and things should be safe. That's the idea behind all that. But these are the ones that are required by law. If you're building a building, partway through they have to get it inspected, before the wiring has to be inspected before you put the insulation, drywall, and that kind of stuff up. And if something's not right, the inspector will say nope, and you literally need to take it out and redo it till it passes the way it should, and then you can continue on with the building. NEC is being revised to include Power over Ethernet, standards for Power over Ethernet, which we can use for powering access points, IP phones, security cameras, those kind of things remotely. If I want to know more about standards, yeah, you can actually buy standards, but that's kind of pricey. There's a lot of catalogs or cable install cabling equipment or installation equipment suppliers that will have summaries of these. I'm going to point to summaries when we get to in the lab and we start looking up some of these standards. I'm going to point to a resource that I have that it's almost like a pocket guide that has a bunch of these standards in that you can look up most of what you need there. All right, the cables of cabling. Okay, the cabling we use has evolved over the years because we're not dealing with 10 meg signals anymore. We're dealing with megabits and gigabits of data moving across a cabling. So the development of cabling had to occur to be able to carry that data. Our primary cable used is your unshielded twisted pair. That's predominantly used for horizontal cabling, patch cables out to the workstation. They develop categories of these to indicate what is its bandwidth capability, what's its performance capability. Well, if we go back in time, phone cabling is what a lot of our data cabling was based off of, AT&T. Okay, this was your phone cabling, four wires. They aren't twisted together, just basic cabling. That can handle a certain amount of bandwidth. You know, we're talking K of bandwidth, not megabit or gigabit. We're talking K, kilobits, if you will. As they developed twisted pair cabling, they started then to pair them and twist them together. And that twisting together is for self-shielding, trying to cancel out the effects of interference and crosstalk. It's doing a self-shielding type of thing. So as we went from phone cabling into even category 3, you see we're not even paired or twisted, we're at least paired and twisted now. And now we can start carrying like 10 megabits, if you will, across your category 3. Down here is your category 3 capable of 10 megabits. 10 megabits. Next evolution was your category 5 and 5E. Now we have a much tighter adherence to the twisting. The quality of the cabling, the quality of the copper got even better. That's where the E came from. Enhanced, it was even better than 5. So now with category 5 and 5E, we now have the capability of 100 meg and even some gigabit speeds, gigabit bandwidths, if you will. Category 6 comes along, and now they put a divider in the middle. It almost looks like a plus sign, a plastic plus sign. That's a divider to keep these pairs separated to help reduce the crosstalk and interference between the pairs. Now we can actually increase the bandwidth through, and now we're able to get into the gig and even touching into the 10 gig category. Short distances, but I can reliably carry gig and start touching into the 10 gig category with your category 6. 6A has the divider in and typically has a foil shield around the whole thing. Again, trying to get rid of outside interference so I can increase the bandwidth through this cabling. Now we definitely can be in the 10 gig categories and greater distances than, I think originally only like about 20 or 30 meters it could go, something like that. So now you're able to get greater distances. But it had to be the evolution of the cabling to keep handling the greater bandwidths. They mentioned screen twisted pair. That's pretty much the last thing I showed you. There was a foil shield around all pairs. And there is also shielded twisted pair. This came out of the token ring days, but you would actually shield each pair individually. Shield each pair individually. That was your shielded twisted pair. Well, as I roll back through some of these, you're starting to see pieces of that worked into the category cabling to handle the higher bandwidths. Coax cabling, we at least want to be aware of because we do see it in residential use. It's not in the 568 standard, but it is in the National Electric Code 570 for residential use, if you will. So it can be used for residential. Here is a piece of coax. You have the central conductor, and then you have the braided shielding around the outside. Okay, that is your basic structure for. There did exist RG8 and RG58. RG8 was the thick coax that was used originally for the 10 base 5 networks, and then RG58 was the thinner coax for 10 base 2 thin net networks. So and again, I pop up Bob Metcalf here because he was the kind of the brainchild behind Ethernet as we know it. Here was that thick coax RG8 and the transceiver that bolts around that. Here's the transceiver that's bolted around that to tap into the network. And then this cable here would go into the back of the computer, into the network card on the computer. And that is how you got your original coax Ethernet network. Then evolution came along with RG58, a thinner coax using T-connectors. T-connectors connecting onto the back of the PC. And there's the T-connector on the back of the NIC, if you will, and a terminator that would get used at the end of the network to absorb the signal so it would not bounce back. That was your thin net Ethernet network. That was the step 2, phase 2, if you will, of Ethernet. You do see coax used at home. A lot of times it's either RG59 or RG6. Newer coax in homes would probably going to be RG6, able to handle better signals, less signal loss over better distances, if you will. And you might have this type of F-type connector on that piece of coax. Older coax like that ThinNet was using the BNC connector here, just for familiarity's sake. And optical fiber. Optical fiber tends to get used for our backbone connection between our closets. We will later this semester be hooking up fiber links between switches and even doing some termination of fiber so we can get a little bit more familiar with the types of and termination of connectors of fiber optic. Wireless, we need to remember that we have access points that are going to connect into the network, and they're going to be wired in the network, typically using unshielded twisted pair cabling. We'll plug them into basically a switch port. An outlet may be installed above the ceiling, and then into a switch port in the closet for that wireless signal. There were some experiments with using infrared for connection between buildings, wireless connection between buildings, literally kind of beaming a signal from one building to the window of another building, picking that up. And there was even experiments using power lines for data transmission, broadband over power line. That did not take off as well as many people had hoped. However, there are some people that use an adapter like this to connect maybe the first floor of your house to the second floor using your electrical wiring. It does work. It does have some limitations on, I think, on bandwidth, but it does work for that kind of connection from floor to floor of a building in a house. You run your data over the existing electrical wiring in the house, if you will. So there is some standards that they touched on in the end of Chapter 1.